Well, golly, I must tell you, I am just so pleased to see so many of you show up here on this spring day. There's twice the number of folks here that I expected we would see today, so thank you so much for coming in. This is, for Clay and myself, this is our last presentation for this year. We know that a number of you have come out to all of these, and some of you have come to some of them, and there may be some of you here that are to your very first one. And I just want you to know that we really, really appreciate the fact that you will take time out of your Sunday afternoons to come and listen to the two of us talk about whatever the topic is at any given time. And so we really appreciate the support, because if we showed up here on Sundays and nobody showed up, I guess we'd stop. We'd stop, yeah. And so I really appreciate that. We also, I really appreciate, and I know Clay does as well, the folks that have helped us through this whole series this year so that we could actually do this. And Robin, can you come in for just a second? If you don't know Robin, she's the mastermind behind all of this. She makes sure that all the literature is done, all the ads are done, everything gets done. So please thank Robin for that. Thank you, Robin. And in the back, we've had Dean has been just so good about all the technical stuff and getting us hooked up and all that. And we've got Mark running the camera and has been running the camera. And I think Dusty's back there helping him today. So thank you guys, too. This most of you may know, or some of you may know, that Access Cable Channel 12 actually carries these. And it wouldn't be possible if we didn't have the filming going on and all that sort of stuff. And then we have students that are actively involved in this as well. There's a class, Mark's class, and what they do is they insert the PowerPoint slides in the right spot into the video, so when you're watching it on TV, and the slides are there. And at any rate, so it's really a learning process for them as well as us as we've worked our way through it. So we've made it all the way through. This is our second year, and it's just been a wonderful, wonderful delight to be able to do this and to work close with my friend here, Clay. And we've just had a lot of fun doing this.
No, I thank especially Robin, who's done all this extraordinary work to make this happen, and Shyla Schaefer has been a big supporter of this project, and so it's just great to see everyone here. I have just a couple quick things to say. First of all, thanks for coming on such a, it's a little windy now, but it's still extraordinary that spring has finally come, and I'm eager to get into my garden and start tilling. And I'm really thankful, Larry, I don't know if you've been watching, but there are a very significant number of young people here today who were not alive when we landed on the moon in 1969. You sort of assume that that's something that happened in this generation, but actually now we're in the next generation, and there are people here today who don't remember that. They may remember where they were when the Challenger blew up or the Columbia, but this is now a historical memory that predates most of the people who are alive in the United States, which is a bit daunting to think about.
It is. It is. Is that too loud?
Feels a little loud.
It feels loud to us, but it's okay to you guys? Okay, all right.
Okay, we'll speak up.
Okay.
At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Oh, that looks beautiful, Samuel.
It has a stark view beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, disarm exit. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, reading the loud and clear. Our position 1330.
Isn't that fabulous? I tell you, it just chokes you up. The launch, Ralph Abernathy, the Southern Christian, what was it called?
Leadership
Organization.
Organization.
Was down there to protest that money was being spent on this program. And later on, he said that once the rocket launched, he never felt prouder of being an American than watching that rocket launch. And it really did. For those of us that were alive then, I know you can feel that, what it felt like to watch that launch and to watch him step off. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the moon. So, where would you like to start the conversation?
Well, let's start this way. I was making, just before we started, I made a little list of things that sort of put this in perspective. Number one, why did we go? I mean, it may seem obvious to you, but it actually isn't that obvious when you start to read the literature. Why did we do it? Number two, how did we do it? And of course, this makes it look easy, but you and I are going to get beyond our capacity to understand what we're saying if we try to talk about how we did it, because it's extremely complex Newtonian mechanics. But why did we do it? How did we do it? What did we accomplish in doing it? Why did we stop? This is what we're talking about is 41 years ago come July, and the last man on the moon, Eugene Cernan, was there in 1972. So that's 38 years ago. So why did we stop is another question. And then finally, the question that I'm most interested in is, what does it signify? And we'll get into it a little bit with some comments that were made by Walter Cronkite and Wernher von Braun and Margaret Mead and Eric Sevareid and so on. But what does it signify? I mean, is it just, for example, if you send a submarine down into the bottom of the Mariana Trench near Guam, it's 37,000 feet deep there. It's the lowest trench in the ocean. And to do that would require funding and technical mastery and people brave enough to do it. And you would then send recording equipment and bring back data. If you did that, it would be a great achievement. Is that the same kind of great achievement that this is, or is it a different kind of great achievement? Does the fact that we left the Earth's orbit for the first time and went to another planet, to another body in the solar system, is that a fundamental difference from climbing Mount Everest or exploring the Mariana Trench, or is it just a really extraordinary technological gimmick? So what does it signify? And this photograph is now regarded as the most famous photograph ever taken, the most downloaded photograph ever taken, and it's of Earthrise. And as you know, it was Bill Anders on Apollo 8 who took this photograph. And I have a book called Earthrise, The Significance of It, and people then predicted, including Bill Anders, that humanity would never see our world in the same way again, because this was the first time in history that we'd had a chance to get far enough away to look at the Earth as a whole. The astronauts who went up in Mercury and Gemini and the Soviet systems could see a significant portion of the planet, but they could never see all of it. They could never see one whole sphere side of it. And so this was the first time humans had ever gotten far enough away to look back. And they did not expect to take this photograph. Apollo 8 had a very specific mission to orbit the moon and test those key burns that would get them in and out of lunar orbit. They were just kind of sitting there waiting to do the next thing, and one of them looked out the window and saw this. And they had not, in all of their training, and as you know, they train for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, and every possible exigency is built into the simulations. They had never anticipated this moment. And suddenly they look back and see this blue marble of a planet. And one of the astronauts said he could put his thumb in front of his face and he could obliterate the Earth with his thumb. It was that small. And so they thought, the astronauts who did this, particularly Apollo 8, and then the commentators who thought about this, said this will be the pivotal moment in the maturation of the human species. And so the question is, how well are we doing?
Yeah, how are we doing? Yeah. On that, the idea of being able to hold your thumb up and cover up Earth, Neil Armstrong talked about that as well, and they asked him when he did that, did it make him feel like a giant? And he said, no, it made me feel very small.
Far away, yeah.
Because here he is all that way, and your home is, you can cover up with your thumb, so it's incredible. Okay, so
those are
questions that you've raised.
Why'd we go? What did we accomplish? How did we do it? Why did we stop? What does it all mean? And I suppose you could add one more. What's next? You probably all know that President Obama 10 days ago chose to cancel the Orion program that was to take us back to the moon sometime before 2025. And he not only canceled that, but he canceled the rocket that would have made that possible. And so one of the things that's now happening is that the shuttle has been our human launcher from the end of Apollo until next year. The last shuttle mission, there have been 131 of them. The last shuttle mission is scheduled for sometime in 2011, after which the shuttles will be scrapped. And we have no launcher from that moment into the foreseeable future that can put a human being in space. If we want to be in space between 2011 and X, and people think it'll be at least 2025 now, if we want to be in space, we will have to go up on a Soyuz Russian rocket. Or if the commercial launchers come online, it's possible that sometime during that period we could have a commercial vendor, a kind of a FedEx launch. But there will be no American launcher that can put a man or a woman in orbit from 2011 until at least 2025. Meanwhile, China has already, I didn't even remember this, did you? China has already put astronauts in space. They've undertaken the most significant moon mapping program ever. Their plan is to use every sort of camera, GPS unit, infrared, you name it, and they are going to map the moon in a definitive way on behalf of mankind. And they also plan to have a space orbiter by 2020 and to land a Chinese individual on the moon by 2025. Whether they'll make that deadline is an open question, but theoretically the next person on the moon is going to be Chinese.
I read recently that it said that Americans, this author said that Americans probably won't be interested in the moon until we see a Chinese folding up the U.S. flag up there.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I don't like this at all. That it's one thing that we stalled. I can understand that because of the technological problems of the space shuttle. The space shuttle, not to get ahead of ourselves, but the space shuttle was sold to NASA and sold to Congress as a cheap way of putting freight into space. And the astronaut program was really just a secondary. It was like a railroad freight train system to get freight inexpensively into space. In order to sell it to Congress and to NASA, they said that they were going to do 700 missions between 1978 and 1992. They wound up doing 131 missions to 2010. And the cost of freight has actually been higher per kilo on the shuttle than it would have been if we'd maintained the Saturn rockets. And so it has been a failure in just so many ways and a disappointment in so many ways. So you can understand how that might have stalled out, but to think that we then have not developed a parallel rocket delivery system that could get us back to the moon or to Mars or wherever it is we might want to go I think is a very significant, not to make a judgment about it, it's a very significant moment in American history to make that choice, no rather than yes.
Yeah. And then we spent all our time, if this is the Earth, we spent all our time doing this.
Spinning.
Yeah, for the last 40 years, as opposed to going out someplace. And we're going to touch on that a little bit today about what happened. So, well, let's take a look at this and get moving on, and then we'll be back on these discussions about this.
There's the New York Times from the day that we landed on the moon, July 20th, 1969. To prepare for this, you've read a couple of books, I've read 4 or 5 books. It's been just fascinating. This is one of my favorite subjects, and yet there's a whole new literature about it. And before we lose our memory on this, I just want to recommend to everyone Craig Nelson's book, Rocket Men. It's really the most detailed study ever made of the Apollo 11 mission, but it in the course of that, it also talks about the whole space program and the Soviet space program. So Rocket Men by Craig Nelson. But so most of what I know, or at least most of what's fresh in my mind, comes from this book. And he says that this was the largest headline in the history of the New York Times. You know, they famously play the world down. Banner headlines are not their thing. It was the largest headline that they ever used.
The other thing this headline reminds me of is, and we sort of take it for granted that the U.S. flag was planted on the moon, but that was not a foregone conclusion at the beginning of the space program, whether or not there was going to be a U.S. flag planted up there. Some folks argued for a United Nations flag, and so there was all kinds of discussion about what was going to be actually planted on there. And Congress then, when they appropriated the funding for the Apollo program, specifically put in the language in the bill that a U.S. flag would be planted on the moon. That was a requirement. And interestingly, before Apollo 11 ever left, and I did not remember this until I was reading this stuff recently, but before Apollo 11 flew, this topic was coming up at news conferences, and they asked Neil Armstrong what he felt about planting a U.S. flag on the moon, and did he think he should be doing something differently. And in typical Armstrong fashion, Neil Armstrong says, "My job is to fly the spacecraft. My job is not to make decisions like that. That decision was made appropriately by the United States Congress, where that decision should be made, and I will carry out whatever they want me to do." Which really spoke to his drive as an astronaut. He was a pilot. He was going to take a spacecraft to the moon, and all this political stuff was not his concern. So,
but Larry, you know, apropos of that, there's a passage in here, and if I could find it, I would get it for you. But this came pretty late in the game, this flag issue. It wasn't part of the original planning, and so as we got sort of close to where we knew we were going to actually do it, then there was this, what kind of tokens do you take to the moon? And then Congress weighed in, because there was thought of taking a United Nations flag to the moon, and there was thought of taking a NASA flag to the moon. And then Congress stepped in and said, no, it will be an American flag only that goes to the moon. But at the same time, this is so interesting to me as a Lewis and Clark scholar, at the same time Congress wrote into that legislation, our planting a flag on the moon is not intended as a sovereignty claim to lunar soil. Because if you go back to Lewis and Clark, at the time of the colonization of the exploration and the colonization of the New World, each European country had a different sovereignty system. So if you were Spanish, your way was to plant a cross and the imperial flag of Spain, and to give a sermon, is to invoke God. If you were the French, you had a very different sovereignty ritual. Each of the major European powers had developed a different sovereignty ritual, and this was accepted under international law. And you literally had to do those things, or you lost your claim that Florida now belonged to Spain, or that North Dakota now belonged to the French. And so the English sovereignty system, which is very typical Anglo, there's a wonderful book on this subject about different nations' sovereignty systems in this era, but the English-speaking world sovereignty system is to build a fence or to plant a flag or to build a barn or a shelter or something, but you have to improve the property. Not so in Spain or France and other nations, but for America you had to build something, you know, a fence or something, but a flag would do. And so this probably could be construed under international law as an American claim to the moon, or at least to the Sea of Tranquility. But Congress, kind of wanting to cut the difference between their insistence on an American flag and a more global idea of what this represented, then said, but we by no means regard this as a sovereignty claim.
Well, when you think about, this is way off our subject here, but when you think about the flag planting, you think about Iwo Jima putting the flag up, you think about the soldier that put the U.S. flag over the statue of Saddam Hussein when they got in the Baghdad.
Came down very soon.
Came down very soon, very quickly.
But this is, my point is, these things matter. This may seem like an expression of patriotism, but it actually is a very complex gesture under international law, so that when Lewis and Clark, for example, got here, they gave peace medals, and those peace medals had Jefferson's face on them, and then the clasped hands of peace on the other side, and it said peace and friendship, and they gave certificates of good behavior. They'd written up a whole series of blanks. They would say, you know, Chief Scogan of the BSC tribe has behaved quite well, and then they'd give you that sheet of paper. I don't know what Indians were supposed to do, frame it and put it in their earth lodge, but they were actually giving away these certificates of good behavior, and they gave away ceremonial gorgets, which are neck armor, and so on. All of this they were doing as a sovereignty gesture. The Indians didn't know this, presumably, but if I'm Sheheke of the Mandan, and I accept the peace medal and the certificate of good behavior, I have entered into a formal diplomatic international relationship with the United States, and now I'm bound in certain ways to that ritual. And so this whole flag thing is way more important than it seems. And if the Chinese did fold up our flag, we'd get it. I mean, that would be provocation to war, probably.
I hope not to war, but we would get it.
We'd be upset.
I agree. We would be upset. Okay.
There they are.
Let's talk about the crew a little bit. Jim, you ever meet these guys? I suspect you did. So, which one?
Repeat whatever he said.
So if we say something that you don't like, Jim, you tell us, okay, if we're wrong here. Okay, all right,
Great.
thank you. The smiling guy on your left is Neil Armstrong.
38 years old.
38 years old, turned 39 on August 4th after he got back from the moon. The guy in the middle is Jim Collins.
Mike Collins.
Mike Collins. And then Buzz Aldrin is the guy that you might recognize from Dancing with the Stars recently.
It's come to this.
It is, yeah, you know, the second man to walk on the moon. We're going to talk more about their personalities, I think, because we're going to come back to this slide here in a little bit. But these are the three guys that did it. They had all been test pilots. Somebody had written that talking to one of these astronauts was like talking to the guy next door. They were down to earth kind of guys, and someone else responded, "Yeah, if you live on MIT," because these guys were very, very well educated. Buzz Aldrin had a PhD and did his dissertation on rendezvous in space before anybody had ever done anything like that. Neil Armstrong had, I'm forgetting now, Neil Armstrong's degree.
He was an engineering degree.
Neil Armstrong's an engineer, very reticent guy. We'll talk more about that. And the one that was supposed to be fun to be around was Collins. The other two were not because of the huge ego that Aldrin had, and because Armstrong was such a reticent individual, very quiet. And we'll talk about this, but Collins described themselves as amiable strangers as that team. And others commented that usually when a crew was put together, the three of them hung out together, they would show up together for training, they would do all this. But when these three guys showed up, they all came in individual cars, and they were not, they really were strangers, but they were amiable to each other. At one point, Deke Slayton, who was the commander, I guess, for lack of a better term, I don't know, what was his exact term?
He's the director of the astronaut corps.
Okay. At one point, he went to Armstrong, and he said, Buzz Aldrin is so hard to get along with, he says, why don't we switch out Jim Lovell? And Jim Lovell can be on Apollo 11 with you, and then we will move Aldrin to a later flight, which would have probably been 13, because it would probably been a swap. And I just try to think about what would have happened if Jim Lovell had not been on 13 and Aldrin had been there. I don't know, maybe it would have played out the same way, but it would have been interesting. And then Lovell would actually have gotten to be on the moon. He was on Apollo 8, went around the moon, and then went back up on 13 to land on the moon, and then because of the disaster with 13, ended up going around it again and coming back. So anyway, that's our crew that we're going to talk about today.
Well, I'm sure most people know what this slide is. This is the Lunar Excursion Module, the so-called LEM, descending to the moon's surface, or ascending from the moon's surface. And this is from Apollo 11. Most of the spacecraft had to be aerodynamic because they were sent through the Earth's atmosphere. But once you get through the Earth's atmosphere, it doesn't really matter how you configure your craft because you're in a place without an atmosphere and not zero gravity, but very low gravity. And so this is an ungainly craft that could never have landed on the Earth, but it could land in the 1/6 gravity and the airlessness of the moon. So I think this is the ascent here. Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon. One of the funny things that, talk about amiable strangers, but they took these photographs and they had a camera set up, a very primitive camera, if you remember from that night, and it was an automatic camera that swung out from the leg, and then you saw that ghost picture that was on the original clip here of Neil Armstrong climbing down and making his famous statement. But they also had Hasselblad cameras. And of course, trying to work these cameras with these suits on and these heavy mittens, it's like trying to play with an electronic piece of equipment in the winter here when you go out, only worse probably. But they had them, and this is before digital photography, so they're shooting on Hasselblad-sized film, much larger than 35 millimeter. And they have to be careful, therefore, because they can't take all the pictures that they want. And they actually have a checklist way before the mission of the photos that they're supposed to take, and then there's a very small little discretionary area for fun photos. Well, it turns out, I didn't know this, I don't think you did either, that all the photographs you have of man on the moon that are in any way close-ups are of Buzz Aldrin. And Neil Armstrong took dozens of photographs of Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin took only 4 photographs of Neil Armstrong and never one that's a close-up. So you see him off on the horizon putting up a aerial package of some sort or doing a seismic thing, but either accidentally or on purpose. Buzz Aldrin took 4 and 4 only photographs of the first man on the moon. And so whenever you see photographs of the salute or the visor and the reflection and so on, that's all Armstrong shooting Buzz, the second man on the moon. So it would be hard, that might be passive aggressive, or maybe it was just a historical accident, but it's an interesting one.
Well, Buzz said it was an accident.
Well, he would, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Okay.
So let's step back. We should get this going.
We should get this going, are we?
Yeah, we're slow here.
All right.
So let's just look at 1969 just very briefly. For those of you who were alive in 1969, you remember what a crazy time it was. People think that 1968 was the year that changed everything, and there are books of that title. And it was a terrible year. It was the Tet Offensive. It was when Lyndon Baines Johnson decided not to run again for the presidency. It was the Chicago Convention of 1968.
2 assassinations.
2 assassinations, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. It was a period, it was just a nightmare year in American life, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And however bad it was even worse in 1969. 1969 was just, it's hard to believe now, I mean, even in the post 9/11 environment, where there's been some anxiety and paranoia in American culture, and rightly so, we can't really meet the chaos that was in the world in 1969. It was, I mean, what was happening is that there are two trajectories here. Our technological life, our space program, was making this trajectory towards mastery and excellence and dominion, where humans with machines using Newtonian mechanics and slide rules were showing what humans can do probably better than at any other moment in the history of the planet. There were 5 million parts on a Saturn V rocket alone. 5 million in the rocket, not counting the capsule. And so our technological mastery was just soaring and supreme. It was the year that the supersonic transport came out in the Boeing 747. At the same time, the American dream is sort of in tatters. Almost every major city in America had race riots and fires during 1968 summer and 1969 summer. Vietnam had turned really very sour, and the country was beginning to, I mean, it was coming at different places with different velocities, but the country was beginning to realize that there was no way out, that this was a morass that was going to compromise us. We couldn't win it. It had cost us a lot of the goodwill of the rest of the world. We'd lost 50, not yet, but we would go on to lose a total of more than 50,000 young people. The country was really in a sour, anxious mood about this, and Richard Nixon was elected to the presidency in '68, and his first year as president is 1969, and the first thing he attended to was Vietnam, and he began what he called, if you remember, Vietnamization, where we would turn over the duties of waging the war to the South Vietnamese, and we would then slowly withdraw into advisor status and then pull out altogether. Well, it didn't work out. We did not get out of Vietnam on Nixon's watch. It wasn't until Gerald Ford in 1975 that we finally left, and you remember the helicopter scenes. And so the country was in this, I mean, a real depression of what happened? How did this happen? How did a country as noble as ours get stuck in this quagmire? And why are there race riots all over? And why are our leaders being assassinated? And the youth movement was really rocking the country. You know, we've all come to terms with it now, but there was an enormous hostility of the older generation towards what young people were doing on campuses in San Francisco and rock concerts and so on. I mean, so it's very, anyone who is in the room can remember this. I'm just pointing to little markers from it. But if you weren't there and you're in the room today, it's worth reading a book on 1969, because it was the year when, as a nation, we really were fissuring socially and politically. And I think I don't know how you feel, Larry. I'd be eager to hear, but I think that the country is in some sense still reeling from the last years of the 1960s. That's many of the political fights we're having today, many of the cultural war. We still haven't come to terms with all the chaos that came in about a 10-year period between the assassination of John Kennedy and the helicopter leaving South Vietnam. What do you think?
Well, the point you just make there is that when we think about the 60s, and we need to get on with this, but when we think about the 60s really began in 1963, that we think about the social change that occurs and ends in 1973. I think that sort of the years of the 60s. But I don't know if we're still reeling from that. I think that the society that we have today is based very much on the things that occurred in the 60s, the distrust of government. You know, in 1955, people didn't distrust government. But clearly by 65, we were starting to get there, and then Watergate and the resignation in 73, now we no longer trust government. So on that point, I would agree with you. But
anyway, let's go through this. So
go ahead.
The same week that
2 days
that we landed on the moon, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, as you all know, I mean, this is one of America's central stories, was on Chappaquiddick Island, and he was driving in his Buick, I believe, with a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne, shown here, when his car went off this bridge. He had turned the wrong way, not towards the ferry, but towards an obscure part of the island, and his car went off this bridge, and young Mary Jo Kopechne drowned. Actually, she was suffocated. And this was, so then he gave a televised speech in which he, it's a very interesting document in American history, but he accepted responsibility up to a point, and he said that his behavior was unconscionable, and he asked the people of Massachusetts to let him know whether he should resign from the Senate or continue. And so he really appealed to the people of Massachusetts to let him know if this was a career-stopping moment in his life. Nassau was a little upset that the nation's attention was going in this other direction. I'm sure that from a historical point of view, the Kennedy family was thrilled that there was a space mission then. Because imagine if that had been the only story in town. Imagine if it happened today. I mean, it's just impossible to think of a person surviving such an accident in today's climate of news, but he was able to survive that cataclysm, in part because in some way, it wasn't the biggest story of the month.
Well, this story my wife Allison is from this area, and this was the big story of that time. The moon landing was, so it was.
So anyway, we can move on, but Chappaquiddick is a horrible moment. The My Lai happened in 1968. That was the Abu Ghraib of this, only worse, of the Vietnam War, when our troops effectively slaughtered a village. And this came to light slowly, and it happened in '68, but the country learned about it through investigative articles by the New York Times writer Seymour Hersh in 1969, and it had just it just haunted the country, and it had the same kind of debate that we had after Abu Ghraib. Woodstock, one of the, I suppose you'd say, highlights of the year. 350,000 young people for 3 days in upstate New York, and that's Jimi Hendrix, who played the last song, the Star Spangled Banner, at the end of that 4 days. In North Dakota, Zip to Zap.
Not to be outdone, North Dakotans.
I hope the young people in the room know about this. This was our own Woodstock. Kevin Carvel of the Mott Carvel family was the editor of the NDSU student newspaper, and he just sort of invented this as a weekend retreat for his staff. But he published it in the paper, and it somehow got all over the country, and it became a kind of our own little mini Woodstock. And it occurred in May of 1969, and it led to what you can see, the governor of North Dakota, William L. Guy, reluctantly sent out National Guard troops because some of the people at ZAP were beginning to loot the town and burn things, and so the governor had to intervene. The Manson murders of Sharon Tate, August 9th, 1969.
Charles Manson, you may know, is still alive. He was sentenced to death, and then the capital punishment for the state of California was overturned. And so that meant he automatically then ended up with a life sentence rather than the death sentence, and unfortunately he's still with us.
Oh, don't say that.
He's an evil man.
Well, let's not get into the death penalty here. The fact is he's still with us.
He's still with us, unfortunately.
Oh, come on, Larry. That's a horrible thing to say.
He's no longer with us.
Richard Nixon had his secret plan to end the war. Nixon features in this story in a couple of ways, and there's not much that we need to say about him, but it was he who got to greet the astronauts. He called them on the surface of the moon. I don't know if you remember this, but Neil Armstrong took a call from the President of the United States they had a 2-hour and 31-minute, I think, EVA, very short, and Buzz Aldrin hadn't been told about this, and he was miffed that Neil got to talk to the president. There's a lot of rivalry in these things. And so that was one thing. And then when they came back, you've probably all seen the picture where they're in the containment tent and they're crouching and Nixon is standing there in front of them. So this was John Kennedy's dream. Nixon was never as interested in space as John Kennedy. And in fact, after 1972, Nixon helps to destroy the space program by turning it into a very different direction. But Nixon was able to get the credit to take the photo op at least and to place that call to the moon when you know that it would have been, it would have been a great thing if John Kennedy had still been alive at that time. And didn't you say something about flowers on his grave?
Yeah, the evening of the landing, some anonymous person took flowers to John F. Kennedy's grave at Arlington and left a card with it and said, all it said is, "Mr. President, the Eagle has landed," which I think is just really a profound statement that somebody made, some anonymous person made.
So Nixon got...
So Nixon gets all the credit.
Well, he doesn't get credit, but he gets the moment.
Oh.
Yeah.
He also, I guess, goes down as great presidential sayings when he's talking to them through that crouched window. He says, "Oh, by the way, did you know I called you collect?"
On the moon. No, but okay, that's a cheap shot. But he also said something. I thought you were going to say the other thing that Nixon said. In talking about this to the country at the same time he's on with Neil Armstrong, he said, this is sort of his John Lennon moment, he said, "This is the greatest week in the history of the planet since creation." And you can imagine how that went over with some, because of course there's another great week pretty much at the center, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so his saying that this is the greatest week since creation created a furor, and people denounced it and said that it showed a fundamental lack of understanding. And you got to be watching what you say at all times, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Joe Namath won the Super Bowl.
Is that enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim.
For you young people that don't know who this guy is.
This once mattered.
This once mattered, that's right.
This once mattered. Tiny Tim was you could probably do an imitation of him. But,
no, I'll try not to.
But he had a very high-pitched voice, and he strummed a ukulele, and he was married publicly on The Tonight Show. That's Johnny Carson over there, on December 17th, 1969.
For you young people, Johnny Carson's the guy that did the job before Jay Leno did. Yeah.
This is John Lennon himself on his bed-in when he and Yoko took to a bed for several weeks to protest the fact that they were not allowed to get married and they were not allowed to come to the United States. They were protesting a whole range of things. This was not a peace protest.
Do you recognize the guy sitting in front of him there? Timothy Leary.
Now dead.
Tune in, drop out.
This is the New York Mets in 1969. And then back to Apollo. We barely covered it, but Bob, Ted, Carol, and Alice came out in 1969. Portnoy's Complaint was, probably nobody really remembers Portnoy's Complaint, but it was the best-selling hardcover book of all time up till a few years ago. It just sold like wildfire. It was sort of a kind of a raunchy treatment of suburban sexual activity and so on. This was a year that O Calcutta premiered on Broadway, first public nudity in a theatrical setting. So this was the 60s.
Did 2001 come out in 69?
Yes.
It did. We should have.
Yeah, 2001: A Space
2001:
Odyssey,
Space
Stanley
Odyssey.
Kubrick's
Came on.
space epic. Came late 68 and then Incinerama in 69.
And the number one song in July of 69 was In the Year 2525.
Which is just around the corner.
Yeah, how many of you remember that song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so that gives
Okay.
you some context.
So
There
that's
was also
the
the year
context
of
of 1969.
Hamburger Hill in Vietnam when May of 1969, the Battle of Hamburger Hill, which is regarded as one of the most futile moments in American military history, where we took a hill near the Laos border that had no strategic value of any sort, And it was a very bloody thing to take the hill. And there was a lot of friendly fire because it was a jungle setting and we were doing aerial bombardment, and I think we killed 28 of our own in aerial bombardment. But this was this moment in May of '69 when we took this hill, and then once we had taken it at extraordinary cost, we abandoned it 1 week later, and the Vietnamese enemy retook it. And so this led to congressional investigations, and Ted Kennedy said this means we must get out of the war. I mean, this was a turning point in Congress's attitude towards the war because it seemed so absolutely futile. There was no strategic value to this hill.
So 1969, what we've laid out here is it's the year we're talking about for the moon landing, but there was so much more going on in the country, and to understand the context of all this going on. And as I revisit this stuff, it's hard to remember that all those things occurred.
How old
in
were
such
you?
a small, 17?
I was 14, so where were you?
When? When the landing happened?
Yeah.
Oh, do we want to jump to that?
Well, just to give the people a sense
all
of
right.
it.
I've told the story, and the BSC folks will recognize this story, but the day of the moon landing, my grandparents were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and they were both born before the Wright brothers flew. And here we were in 1969, we were in some hall down in Perkins County, South Dakota, which meant that it was a building all by itself out on where these gravel roads are at. And we were there celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and I was running out to the car and listening on the radio for the landing. And then later on that evening, we were at my uncle's house, and then we got to watch it on the television. So that's where I was.
You were in South Dakota.
I was in South Dakota. Where were you?
I was in Dickinson, and we had an early color television set. This was 1969, so I guess it wasn't too early, but that was our first color television set. And had, if you can all remember this, it had the kind of round screen. It wasn't even a square screen. And so I set up a camera and on a tripod, and we turned off all the lights, and I took hundreds of black and white photographs of the television screen, much to the annoyance of my sister, who thought, why wreck this moment with this? And I still have those photographs. We put one on our website, bsctalk.com, but I took literally hundreds of photographs of the screen. Today you'd record it, you'd digitize it, download it, upload it. But then when something passed on television, it was gone. And there was no guarantee you would ever see it again. And so, I was a real space junkie. And I was fully just thrilled by this moment. And I regarded it as one of those moments you'd never forget where you were, which I guess is true for most. And so I wanted to capture it on camera. Mm-hmm. So it was amusing to find that photograph recently.
Let's talk a little bit about the moon. We got this shot from Apollo 8, and let's actually go back, and then we're going to take off and go forward back into 1969. But let's just talk about the fascination that from a humanities scholar perspective, that antiquity had with the moon, some of the mysteries about the moon.
Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but the moon is this satellite. To the size of its home planet, it's the largest satellite in our solar system. It's only 250,000 miles away. It's 1/80th of our mass, and it's there, and people have known about it for the history of humanity and have had to try to make sense of it. And we don't remember when I don't remember when I first became aware of the moon. I'm sure you don't either. But the moon is an interesting object, and it's startling, and it has phases, and more than that, it affects the Earth. The mutual gravitational dance that the Earth and the moon are in has impact. It causes the tides to go up on the oceans around the world. It actually creates a slight bulge in the surface of the Earth. Many psychologists believe that it affects human consciousness and moods. We know that women's menstrual cycles are tied to the moon. It's a very huge presence, and so almost all, even without scientific instruments, almost all societies have understood that. And so they have tried to come to terms with it. And as long ago as the ancient world, in ancient Greece, there were physicists who were able to calculate the rough distance to the moon. But people have mythologized it. Diana is the goddess of the moon, Aphrodite, not Aphrodite, Diana in the Roman world is the goddess of the moon. And so the ancient people gave it sufficient symbolic emphasis to give it a god, and to then to have to give sacrifices to that god and propitiate that god and so on. And then we get terms like lunatic from the moon, the wide folklore perception that the moon makes people do crazy things when it's full. And so you could follow this endlessly, but the key moment in all of this, I have a book called Naming and Mapping the Moon, which is just utterly fascinating. Every feature on the moon is named. And they've been named for hundreds of years, but much more recently, since the 17th century. But the key moment in all of this came with Galileo. People had seen the moon only with naked eyes until Galileo. And Galileo in the 16th century built what he called an optic glass, a very primitive telescope, and he pointed it into the heavens and he discovered two things, and they were shattering. Number one, he discovered that there were bodies in the solar system that you can't see with the naked eye, including the moons of Jupiter. And so the moons of Jupiter were a threatening idea to what was known as the Ptolemaic worldview. The Aristotelian view, which was codified in the 2nd century by a man named Ptolemy, was that the Earth was the center of the universe. I mean, literally, the Earth is the center. And then the moon is next, and beyond the moon, we have the planets, and at the end of the planets, there are the stars, and the stars are all in the same place. It's like if you took a ceramic bowl, or in a planetarium where you paint the stars on the ceiling, all the stars were at the same distance from the Earth, and beyond them was this kind of ceramic cap on the universe. And so it was a finite universe, and that the stars were on the inside of this cap, and beyond it nothing except God. And so then you have this firmament outside of the Earth, outside of the universe, stars on the interior of that, planets, and then the moon. And below the moon, according to the Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, Augustinian way of seeing, below the moon was the sublunary world, below the moon, the sublunary world. And the sublunary world, even though it's the center of the world, is characterized by sin and disease and death and hard work, strife, because it's imperfect, because of the fall of man in the book of Genesis. The moon is the line of demarcation, and everything beyond the moon is perfection. And if it's perfection, there are no imperfections. And it had all been mapped out. So suddenly Galileo looks out and he sees these moons of Jupiter, and he realizes it's way more complex than we thought. And then he turns his telescope on the moon, and the moon was thought to be a perfect sphere at this time. And he saw mountains on the moon, cavities and coulees and basins on the moon. He saw all these things that don't make it a perfect sphere. They make it an imperfect sphere with features. And this was so shattering, this idea, to the official way of seeing the world that was controlled by the Catholic Church, that they forced Galileo to recant, because he realized, as Copernicus had done, that the sun is the center of our solar system and the Earth is spinning around it. And so for that reason, and for these imperfections that he was discovering within this putatively perfect solar system, universe, he was forced to recant. I mean, he was literally shut down as a free thinker because of what he saw through that telescope. And so the moon, from that time on, I mean, he lost the battle, but he won the war, because we all now agree that it's a heliocentric solar system. So from that time on, this opened the door to a demythologization of the moon. And now for the last several hundred years, we have a folklore tradition of the moon, but most of what we talk about is actually science. And the Apollo missions, even though they were mostly an expression of Cold War technological possibility, they also had a scientific element, and they brought back there were 12 men have walked on the moon between 1969 and 1973, and they brought back 840 pounds of rocks. And so an enormous amount. Some of it was a piece of it here in North Dakota. And so that the moon has been despiritualized, except in popular culture.
Okay. So now let's go to the moon, and let's talk about this. One of the characters that has to figure into this clearly is von Braun, who was a rocket scientist for Nazi Germany.
He was in the SS.
He was in the SS. Camp Dora, it was called. Some of you may be familiar with that. Was where Jewish slave laborers were building rockets that the Nazis were using against the English. And as the war was winding down, and it was obvious, and I say winding down, it was just obvious that the Germans had lost the war, von Braun became very interested on what his post-war career was going to be. And in fact, one of the things von Braun said is, we must now ensure that the baby gets into the right hands. And von Braun didn't care that the missiles, the V-2s, were killing Englishmen. He was interested in the science. How do you put a rocket together? How do you control the rocket? How do you launch the rocket? So he's doing that as a Nazi, and he would have done it regardless of where he was. He was most interested in rocketry. So as the whole thing was falling apart, about 300 scientists that worked with von Braun tried to make it to the American side. And eventually, the United States had what was called Operation Paperclip, and the whole idea of Operation Paperclip was, number one, to get the documents, and they got trainloads of documents that were tied to rocketry, and number two was to get the scientists. And so the United States ended up then with, through this Operation Paperclip, they ended up with von Braun and 110 scientists, and they flew them all to El Paso, Texas. And they kept them at El Paso, Texas, and basically, after debriefing them, said, okay, now we want to have a rocket program.
Not to go to the moon.
Not to go to the moon.
To build weapons.
To build weapons. Von Braun had been building rockets as weapons, and now the United States wanted to have that capability as well. And so we've got 110 German scientists.
Many of whom are sufficiently deep into Nazism that under other circumstances they would have been tried as war criminals. They were allowed to avoid that because we so desperately wanted to employ their knowledge for our own missile program. But later on, one of von Braun's lieutenants, after the successful moon landings, was found out to have been a killer at the Camp Dora, that he ordered the deaths of more than 1,100 Jews. And because of that, then the United States extradited him to Germany, because if he had stayed here, we would have tried him as a war criminal here. So these are not, I mean, I know that these are great scientists, but these are also people who were not just hanging on, trying to survive in the regime of Adolf Hitler. Many of them were important functionaries in the Nazi regime. My dad knew, didn't know, but my dad, they were at White Sands Missile Base in New Mexico, and my father was 18 or 19 years old at the time, 1945, and he was stationed at White Sands as a supply sergeant in the Army. And he got to watch a number of V-2 rocket tests, and he met Wernher von Braun on a couple of occasions and saw him across the officers' quarters and so on. When I was a child, this just kills me. We had several envelopes of about 100 photographs, 8x10 glossy photographs, black and white photographs of V-2 rocket activity, and they've all disappeared because we didn't take good care of them. But it would be really interesting to see those photographs today. But this was where two things happened. Von Braun and his crew came here for military purposes, and they built our missile systems, our surface-to-air missiles, our long-range missiles, our ICBMs. And so the one thing that they did was to give America its superiority in space-delivered nuclear weapons. And the Soviets caught up with us, but for a long time we had the edge on the Soviets because of this group of men who were brought over from Nazi Germany. But then the second thing that happened was when NASA was born out of the military and became a quasi-non-military activity, von Braun's genius was then asked to build rockets big enough to take us to the moon. And it was von Braun who supervised the Saturn V rocket, which is the only rocket that we have had or now have that could have taken us to the moon. So he didn't build that rocket, but he was the supervisor.
Okay. All right. The next point we ought to talk about is the Cold War and John F. Kennedy. There's certainly, and I think, and Clay and I talked about talking about this, and we said we don't want to come off cynical. We don't want to sound cynical, so we're not going to sound cynical. What we're going to do, though, is try to place this drive to get to the moon with JFK into its proper historical perspective. And the point here is that John F. Kennedy shows very little interest in space prior to his pronouncement that we're going to go to the moon. And most people, I think our common American perception is that we ended up going to the moon because John F. Kennedy, gave us the challenge and the Americans stood up to the challenge and we did all that. The reality is John F. Kennedy was looking for anything that he could beat the Russians at. And he was told, and there was conversations about trying to go to Mars, there were conversations about trying to get to the moon, there was conversations about many things that we could beat the Russians at. And so when Jack Kennedy gets up and says that we will go to the moon before this decade is out, I'm sure there's a lot of scientists that were gulping hard because it sounded like an impossible task, but it was driven not because Jack Kennedy just wanted America to do something great. It was driven because John Kennedy wanted to beat the Russians. And in the book that Clay's got right there about rocket men, one of the points, is that what you're looking up right now?
This is what Kennedy was saying. So he gives this famous speech on May 5th, 1961, that everyone knows. It's sort of the anthem or the motto or the mission statement of the moon program. And he still is regarded as this man who was utterly fascinated by space exploration, but he actually wasn't. He had to get talked into this. He was shopping around for something we could do that would prove to the world that we were better than the Soviets. Remember, the Soviets had launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957. We didn't have one. And this caused a crisis in the United States of just major proportions. And Lyndon Johnson famously said he was not going to go to sleep at night with a red satellite over Texas. That we had to shoot it down or we had to compete with it somehow. And there was deep anxiety. This wasn't just, Sputnik wasn't just a little beeping satellite. It proved that if they wanted to, the Soviets could drop weapons, missiles on the United States. That if you can launch a satellite over Bismarck, North Dakota, you can drop something out of it too. Mm-hmm. And so there was a huge anxiety through America about what this represented and how have we fallen behind and how can we catch up. If you remember in the 1960 presidential race, one reason that John Kennedy won was that he alleged that there was a missile gap. Turns out there wasn't a missile gap, and Nixon knew it. Kennedy knew it too. He was doing opportunism and some demagoguery here, but he knew it, and he knew Nixon knew it, but Nixon couldn't say what he knew because he didn't want to betray the secrets, official government secrets about just where we were with the missile parity. And so Kennedy gets points for pointing out that we're way behind the Russians. We weren't, and Nixon was trying to be a good vice president to Eisenhower, and so he didn't say, Mr. Kennedy, I happen to know that you were wrong about this. Yeah. So anyway, this anxiety was huge. Yeah. But here's what JFK actually says. So he's shopping around for anything. Space was not one of his interests. In fact, he was bored by it until after Alan Shepard came to visit him after the first successful launch of a man in April of 1961. Here's what Kennedy said, to his advisors, can't you fellows invent some other race here on Earth that will do us some good? The moon thing just costs too much as far as I'm concerned. And there's much more about his ambivalence, but yeah. It's an American myth that this was John Kennedy's dream. Mm-hmm. He said it was a dream of his, but if it had been something else, he would have been equally heroic, I think.
I was reading the other day, someone said that they wish Jack Kennedy had challenged the Soviets to find the cure for cancer. And had that been the race rather than trying to get to the moon, although I think getting to the moon was a
Let me just
noble
read
race
this one
anyway.
passage. I'm trying to sell this book because I think it's a great book, Rocket Men.
You have stock in it?
No, I don't, Craig Nelson. But there's a passage on page 36 about how the Cold War and the space program and the atomic project, the Manhattan Project, are sort of all interrelated. He says, in so many ways, the race to the moon would turn out to be a sequel to its predecessor's race for atomic mastery. Both were enormous projects that only a great nation on a federal level could afford to attempt and achieve. Both began with Third Reich emigres, Nazi emigres, and a shared geography. Trinity and Alamogordo are a mere 80 miles from Apollo 11's ancestral territory, the ramshackle sprinkling of federal shanties at Fort Bliss that housed the von Braun rocket team in the post-war years, and where Buzz Aldrin lost his virginity to a Mexican prostitute. I don't know why we have to know that,
Yeah.
but it's there.
Glad you shared that with
Well,
us.
I didn't know how to, didn't want to bawdlerize it, but it seems unnecessary to me. Which in turn is 120 miles from High Lonesome in Roswell, where American rocket pioneer Robert Goddard tested the thrust of some of the super-chilled fuels that would send Apollo 11 to the moon. And if the first lunar landing marked the end of the space race and one of the beginnings of the end of the Cold War, the Manhattan Project marked both the end of World War II and the Cold War's birth. For it was then that the English and Americans did not tell the Russians of their wonder weapon until it was ready for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Russians in turn repeatedly and successfully spied on their nominal allies. Stalin's agents were so good, in fact, that the Russian leader knew about the atomic bomb before Harry Truman did. And so you see this kind of, the intermingling. One of the big themes of all of this is the intermingling of our Cold War geopolitical struggle with the Soviet Union, our desire for military weaponry that used the same technologies as the space program, and a genuine human noble interest in exploring the world. And how you sort this out is, I think you've got a slide of the first rocket vehicles, and that tells you a lot. They were both ICBM missiles.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the science of it all. The 36K is interesting. That's the size computer that they had, two computers. One's in the LEM and one's in the command module, and they were each 36K. Now, today, in fact, Drake just bought in fact, he's playing right now with his brand new iPad.
Which I should get as the distinguished, yeah.
Well, if the provost will give you his.
Well, don't I get any bonuses for this?
And what does that have? 64 gigabytes.
I just downloaded Rocket.
Oh, did you? Good. That's just like that. That's great.
So it's like, so
okay,
it's, yeah.
so at any rate, the science of it all. So the LEM and the command module each have a 36K computer in them. Now, for those of you who remember Ataris, there was a 64K, I think, Atari that you bought to play games with, which was a more powerful computer than any one of the computers in the two vehicles. And so they did a lot of this with slide rulers. We don't even teach slide rulers anymore. But a lot of the computations that decided how fast they had to go, how far they had to go, when they would enter orbits, and all that was being done by slide rulers and these two very, very small computers. So there wasn't a lot of computer power.
I heard someone on NPR not so long ago saying that the computer in your car is larger than the computer on the lunar excursion module. And that's just what gives you your mileage and tells you when you need your oil changed. And
right. And the language, the readouts and stuff, for some of you that worked around computers years ago, you know what I'm talking about. It was a foreign language. It wasn't like what we're used to today.
And can I just say a word about that?
Yep.
I mean, I don't know much about this, but I know this much, that if you think of in a football game, when the quarterback sends the runner all the way down the field and then throws this long bomb, that only works if the runner gets to the spot where the ball gets and they both are coordinated in some way, and so most passes are missed. Well, I mean, just take that sort of primitive athletic analogy and magnify it by thousands. Here's what we're trying to do. The moon is traveling at its speed. The Earth is spinning and traveling at its speed. We've got a rocket that weighs, at the beginning, 6.5 million pounds, but it's losing weight moment by moment as it burns up its fuel. So we're sending a rocket from Florida in the United States out of Earth orbit, and then we are sending it to where we know the moon is going to be 3.5 days later. And it has to be within just a few degrees margin of error, otherwise it either crashes into the moon or it flies beyond into space. Now, they can do some course corrections along the way, but we're talking about an incredibly complex thing here. Earth gravitation, the moon's gravitation, the sun's gravitation. The moon has uneven gravitation because of some magnetic clusters that are in it, and so it can throw all of this off. This is something that very advanced computers would have a hard time computing. One of the documentary films I was looking at the other night was, and I was preparing for this, Larry, it said it'd be like firing 2 bullets out of rifles and then asking them to rendezvous. Because when they were rendezvousing, they're not just stationary in space, they're moving. And when they were doing these rendezvous, they were moving at more than 7,000 feet per second, so more than a mile a second. And you have 2 vehicles that are both about the same speed, and they are then trying to rendezvous and dock and decouple. I mean, it's almost unbelievably complex. It's not quantum mechanics, it's all Newtonian mechanics. I mean, Newton, if he were alive, would say, well, this proves that I was absolutely right. But the number of computations it takes is staggeringly high, and the smallest little error, you know, they have these burns where they're behind the moon, and so they're out of radio contact with the mothership or with the Earth. And they have to make a burn of their engine for 252 seconds. And if they do 254 seconds, they crash into the moon. And if they do 251 seconds, they wind up in Jupiter. And they have to get it exactly right. And this is all done with these tiny computers and slide rules. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. If you ask somebody, if you ask the students on this campus to do this, to set up a trajectory to send a probe to Venus, it would take a very, very long time for them to be able to do it because it's very advanced mathematics. There's so many factors playing at the same time. Yeah. And so that's almost more impressive than the rest of it, that we actually were able to do the math to make this thing happen, because this is, we're talking about very long distances here.
The other thing we'll just touch on real briefly is, in the science of all, is the decision on how to actually do this, how to actually get to the moon. And there were 3 possibilities they talked about. One is direct, and the direct idea is the way cartoons always depict it, where there's a rocket here on Earth, it launches, it flies all the way to the moon, it lands on the moon, it launches from the moon again, and it comes back down to Earth. That was the direct route. There were a number of problems with this. Number one, it'd have to be a very, very large spacecraft to be able to do all that. Number two is, you just think about it, that big of a spaceship that's landing on the moon, and now how are they going to get the guys from the top of this spaceship down to the moon itself? And there was even talks about putting an elevator in there and trying to figure out how they were going to do that. Today, this doesn't even make sense to us. But when they were thinking about this in the 1960s, they really didn't know how they were going to do this. So the direct was one of them that they thought about. The Earth orbit was the second one, and that made a little more sense, and that is where you would launch and you would put something into Earth orbit, and then something would launch from it and go all the way to the moon and land and then come back. Well, there were a lot of problems with that too.
But the advantage of that is, if you have a problem, you can abort and get your men back on the Earth. If you do this separation in moon orbit, if your rockets don't fire, you're stuck forever. And so the one advantage that the Earth orbit system had, Earth Rendezvous, was that it was more likely you're going to save your crew in the event of some disaster, like the Apollo 13 disaster.
Yeah. As long as they weren't already to the moon.
Right.
The last one, and the one that was selected, is the lunar orbit. And that is that they would launch, they would leave Earth orbit together, both vehicles, they would go to the moon, they would go into lunar orbit, and that's where Collins ended up as the loneliest man in the world, right? Or the universe, I guess, at the time. And then they would separate, the LEM would go down, it would land, Then they would launch from there, connect back up, and come back to Earth. And that was the third way, and that's the way they decided to do it ultimately. So anyway, anything else on that? Okay, so let's just real quickly, then we'll run through the history. We're actually moving along here. We'll run a little bit through the history of this. Of course, our manned space flight began with the Mercury. Everybody knows about the original 7 astronauts.
Great book on that subject by Tom Wolfe, The Right Stuff.
The Right Stuff.
If you've never read The Right Stuff or seen the movie, both are great, but the book is even better than the film.
And that's the original 7.
It's the Mercury astronauts.
The Mercury
7.
astronauts, the original 7.
One man in the spacecraft, no maneuvering. He is passive.
Spam in a can. In fact, there was a great quote from one of the astronauts when a lot of these blew up when they were trying it, before they actually put the men on them. And some of them had monkeys in, and they had, I guess the Russians used some dogs. We used some monkeys and some chimpanzees. But when one of them blew up, one of the guys said, sure glad they didn't have a monkey in that one, knowing that they were going to be the next on there. So it'd be monkeys at one time, now we're going to put men on it. First time we put a man on it is Alan Shepard in 1961, and all he did was up and down, and that was it. And it was a month after the Russians had already done it. So the Americans were behind.
And they had orbited.
And they had already orbited. So the Russians were ahead, and now the United States has to figure out how to catch up. This is what's most amazing to me on this, Clay, is this is 1961. 1969, we're on the moon.
Including
That's not very many years.
With a disastrous accident at the center of the project.
Apollo 1.
Right, so I mean, not only is it that incredibly short amount of time between May 61 and July 1969. Today, I mean, I've heard NASA symposiums where they say we couldn't do it today. I mean, we literally couldn't do it in 8 years if we had an unlimited budget. It's an impossible demand. So not only did they do it in that incredibly small amount of time, but there was a major accident right in the center of it. Apollo 1 had a fire on the launch pad on January 27th, 1967. 3 astronauts were killed. The space program was in danger of being canceled. There was a huge national uproar about this, and then there was a series of investigations, and they completely redesigned the Apollo capsule to take advantage of what they had discovered from this disaster. And we didn't fly for 23 months, so we lost a big chunk right in the center of it, too.
Redstone and Atlas, and the only reason I want to point those out, those are both military rockets. ICBMs, these were designed, we're launching men into space. Actually, Alan Shepard was on the Redstone, and so was Gus Grissom. He was the second man, didn't orbit, just up and down again. They were both launched on Redstones, and then the rest of the Mercuries were launched on Atlas. And Atlas was designed to be an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, to deliver nuclear weapons. And instead of delivering nuclear weapons, they're firing these guys in these capsules into space, one guy at a time. So Glenn orbits in '62, the first American to orbit. Shepard, again, was the first American in space. And actually, the neat thing about Alan Shepard is that he actually ends up on the moon eventually. I think he was the 5th American to walk on the moon.
There have been 12. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, David Scott, James Irwin, John W. Young, Charles Duke, Eugene Cernan, and Harrison Schmitt. 12 people, all Americans, have touched the surface of the moon.
Okay, Mercury was followed by Gemini. And you look at this, 65, 66, it seems to me Gemini lasted longer than that, but it didn't. And now the purpose for Gemini, Mercury was just to see, can we put a man in space?
Can he survive in space? Can we re-enter?
And bring him back safely, right? Put him up, orbit, bring him back safely. So that's Mercury. Gemini now becomes really important to the Apollo program because Gemini's going to do the 3 things I've got on the bullets there. Can you get in space? Mercury capsules really were cans. I mean, there wasn't a lot of flying on the astronauts' part, up into space, back down.
You couldn't change your orbit.
Couldn't change your orbit, couldn't maneuver in space. So what Gemini does for the American Apollo program is demonstrates that they can maneuver in space. Secondly, they've got to be able to rendezvous. Now the big reason to rendezvous in space, because we already sort of mentioned, is you have the LEM and you have the command module. These are two separate vehicles, and what they're going to do, what the plan is now that they've decided on lunar orbit for the landing, is they're going to launch them. They launch them together in a package. Then that package is taken apart, they're turned around and they're hooked back together, and now they're going to go to the moon. So they have to be able to rendezvous. And again, Buzz Aldrin had done his PhD dissertation on rendezvous in space, so he's an important piece to this. And Armstrong was on Gemini 8, which really is important because it's the first time they try rendezvous and they almost lost. A thruster got stuck and they started spinning and they ended up having to abort and actually land. It was the first time in the American space program that they had an emergency landing of one of our spacecrafts, and Armstrong was on that. But Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin were all part of the Gemini program as well. Again, Titans launched these. Titans were ICBMs. Titans, as an ICBM guy, when I went into active duty in ICBMs, Titans were still in our inventory, and we used to call them the crowd pleasers because they had the big bombs on the Titans, and because they could throw a much larger bomb than I was in Minuteman, and we could only throw little bombs, but the Titans could throw the big bombs. So, but again, it's an ICBM. That's what it was designed for. But now we're putting men in space on the Gemini program on the Titans.
Can I just say, I mean, the extra one, the last one is EVA. Go ahead and say that, and then I'll say something.
Oh, I didn't say that. I'm sorry.
Right.
The extravehicular activity, you had to have somebody that could get out of a spacecraft, and could they survive that? And of course, the famous story, Ed White got out and his glove took off, and NORAD is still tracking his glove that's up there with.
Well, not his only
thousands
glove. I mean, his auxiliary glove.
Okay.
If he'd lost his glove, he would have died.
Well, yeah, but a glove
Right.
floated out.
But we did 3 spacewalks, EVAs, in the Gemini program. I remember them. You probably remember when Ed White was out for 21 minutes, and it was a huge moment in American history in the 1960s. But there were 3 of them. Ed White was out for a very short time, and then Eugene Cernan was the second person to do a spacewalk, and he had terrible problems. His visor, he overheated, and his heart rate went way up because he couldn't get a foothold anywhere. There was nothing to grab onto, and according to Newtonian mechanics, if you try to screw a screw with a screwdriver, you turn. The only reason we don't turn is that we live in a world of gravitation, but if we lived in a gravity-less world, if you turn a screwdriver, it's going to twist you the other way. So he couldn't get footholds, and he was overheating, and his heart rate went up, and he was getting terribly fatigued and frustrated, and his visor clouded over. He got a little clouding in his visor, so he was almost blind. And they had to bring him back on an emergency basis. And so when that incident occurred, there was widespread concern that maybe spacewalking is going to be impossible. So then NASA developed a whole series of techniques, and the techniques were tried by none other than Buzz Aldrin. This is probably why he got to the moon. Wrote the dissertation on rendezvous. He mastered spacewalking. He did a long spacewalk on one of the last of the Gemini flights, and he was out for a long time, and he did a lot of different work and experiments, and they had places for footholds, and they had handholds along the side of the capsule, and they solved the problem of the EVA, without which they wouldn't have been able to finish the program.
And one of the things, if you can think of stair steps, that's what's happening with the Mercury. Can we get them up there? Can we bring them back safely? You know, we're not going to do a lot of fancy stuff. Then we got into Gemini. Now we're doing some stuff that's a little more difficult, but we're stepping our way to the point which we're going to land a man on the moon. But each mission has very specific things that it's doing, and they're not just doing it to say, well, gee whiz, this would be fun to do. They're doing it because it's something that's going to be tied to getting an Apollo landed on the moon, everything that they're doing. So they're stair-stepping as we go along, okay? So that takes us to the Apollo mission. Now, the Apollo is on a Saturn, which was not designed for anything but this, a big throw vehicle to get something up in space.
It's not a military vehicle.
It's not a military vehicle. This is the first one that's not an ICBM. And out of the Apollo mission, I know Clay wants to talk about Apollo 8 because I think we both agree Apollo 11 is really neat, but Apollo 8, you know, we think of Apollo 11 because man actually walked on the moon and, you know, they landed there and they did all that sort of stuff. But the real humans that went farther than any other humans before them, the first humans to ever see the backside of the moon, were the guys on Apollo 8, and I know you want to talk about it.
Well, just for a second about Apollo 8, I mean, probably some of you remember it, but it was December of 1968. And here's why it's so remarkable. Not only was it the first time that human beings ever left Earth orbit, first time ever. It was the first time that we did a circumnavigation around the moon and back and went into lunar orbit. It's the first time we saw the backside of the moon. So there were lots of space firsts. But more importantly than that, there had been the Apollo 1 disaster. And then they had done a couple of other Apollo flights, but one without humans in it, and then just an orbital flight. And there was concern that the Soviets were going to get to the moon first. And there was a technological problem, because when Apollo 8 came up for its moment, the lunar excursion module wasn't finished. It was behind schedule. And so the original plan had been that they would go out into Earth orbit and undock, and the lunar excursion module would wander around and then redock, but sort of not land, but practice landing maneuvers. And that was the original mission of Apollo 8. Well, then they find out that the lunar excursion module is literally not ready, so they can't take it. So now what? You have to decide what you're going to do with the mission without that key stair step that you're taking up towards a successful moon landing. And so I think it was George Low, who was the man who came up with this idea, said, let's go for it. Since we don't have a lunar excursion module, let's send the service module all the way to the moon and back, and we'll make this will be truly a giant leap. And they did it. And this is what makes it even more interesting. Human beings had never been on top of a Saturn V rocket before. This was the third flight of the Saturn V rocket. On the first two flights, the unmanned flights of the Saturn V, there were terrible problems. On the first one, a number of engines actually shut down prematurely, which means they could not have gotten to the moon. On the second one, there was a pogo effect in which there was just violent shaking and shimmying, so much that it might have broken up its coupling with the capsule on top. So these are the two and only two tests of this rocket.
Neither successful.
Neither exploded,
but they weren't successful.
But neither one could be called a success. Neither one could get you to the moon. And the second one might have been lethal to somebody who was shaking at the top of that rocket. So then the third time they use that rocket, they send people to the moon. I mean, would you get on that rocket?
I know.
I mean, they tell you, oh, we've never had a successful test of this, but we're just going to send you to the moon tomorrow. And they said yes. And so the fact is, I mean, we were taking, in Rocketman, he quotes Gene Kranz, who was this longtime director of flight operations at Cape Canaveral. He said, Kranz later said, this was the greatest gamble in the history of the space race, that mission. So it works. They not only have a flawless third test of the Saturn V, it takes them into trans-lunar trajectory. They get to the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968. And if you were alive then, I know you remember this moment, because when they were orbiting the moon, the astronauts read from the first verses of the book of Genesis. And it was just an unbelievably moving moment. My father was an atheist, and he wept, because it was just so moving to hear the Judeo-Christian origin story being read by these techno-engineers at the first planet, the first place that humans were ever going to go besides the Earth. And it was, I don't know what possessed them to do this, but it was an absolutely magical moment in American life. And nobody who was alive on that night can ever forget it. It was Christmas Eve. And there was just, then they closed by saying, good night and good luck, all of you back on the good earth. And there was just the pride, I mean, just unbelievable pride. Of course, it probably also was partly done as a way of, as an American response to communism, because communism is officially atheist. And so here was a a different approach on the moon, but unbelievable. So that Apollo 8 mission was also the mission that led to the famous photograph. That's the Earthrise photograph. The most famous photograph ever taken was taken by Bill Anders, almost by accident, as they approached the moon.
I was going to wait to talk about this, but let's talk about this right now because of the Bible reading. NASA got in trouble over that, by the way, and you guys remember Madeleine O'Hare? She was the atheist.
She sued NASA for breach of the separation of church and state doctrine of Mr. Jefferson.
Because the Bible was read by these NASA astronauts.
And I think that's insane.
It's insane. But what's interesting out of that is, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we're running out of time anyway, when Aldrin and Armstrong land on the moon, Aldrin, go ahead.
It's such an amazing moment. So they land in the LEM and they do a kind of attaboy high five kind of a thing. And then Aldrin, this is maybe the most amazing moment in the history of the space race. Buzz Aldrin is a Catholic, and he takes out a little packet. Each one gets to carry a little personal pack, like a shaving kit. And he pulls out a chalice and a wafer, and he pours a tiny little bit of red wine into the chalice, and he takes the Mass. And
and he read John.
He read silently. He did not read it to the public. He had been warned because of this lawsuit not to make this a public announcement. And Neil Armstrong was not particularly pleased with this little Catholic moment either. So he did it privately, but he said, I hope you all now will take a moment of silence to reflect to whomever it makes sense for you to reflect about this monumental moment in human history. But then he does the Eucharist on the surface of the moon. Is that extraordinary? I mean, what a moment.
Yeah.
I like Buzz Aldrin
for that.
For lots of reasons, but that's a great thing that he did.
It is, and I'm sure he's the only human that's done that. I don't know that any of the others that did it. So, okay. So that brings us to Apollo 11. Just a little bit about the patch is originally the patch had the olive branch that the eagle was carrying was in the beak. And, we've all seen pictures like that, and the talons are out. And that had been designed by Collins. But NASA took it and they changed this so that the eagle wouldn't be coming down with the talons open like an eagle that would be attacking a poor little rabbit or something like that. It would look more aggressive. So they took the branch and they put it into the eagle claws.
It's delivering peace to the moon.
So peace to the moon as opposed. Okay.
There they are again.
There they are again. So now we'll just talk briefly about each one of them and some of their idiosyncrasies, I guess. I'm really interested in Armstrong.
Why?
I just find him such an intriguing person, and I think, and I'll get to answering that, but I don't know that that Buzz Aldrin could have been the first man on the moon. Now that was a real rub, by the way, between the two of them, because Buzz Aldrin wanted to be the first man to walk on the moon. And on all other missions, the commander had stayed with the ship, and the pilot, the second guy, would be the one that did the things like the EVAs and all that. And so Buzz Aldrin just assumed that, we land, the commander's going to stay in the LEM, and I'm going to be the first man out.
That would have been standard protocol.
That would have been protocol. But there's all sorts of speculation about why it was done the way it was. To begin with, the two, Aldrin and Collins, are both military officers. Neil Armstrong now is a civilian. So part of the logic in having Armstrong do it is that it's not a military guy that's the first person on the moon. It was, in fact, a civilian. Even though he was a veteran of the Korean War, he had been a military pilot. At this time, he's a civilian, and so that's one of the reasons. Another reason they used was that they're in this very small thing. They said it was like two football players suiting up in a telephone booth because they're in this very small thing, and he would have had to come from one side to get over to the hatch. Aldrin would have, and they said, well, it just makes more sense that Armstrong's by the hatch, that he
just logistically.
Logistically, it just makes more sense for him to be the first man off. But I think a lot of it had to do with the personality. Armstrong was not a braggart. Armstrong was an engineer. Armstrong was very analytical. Armstrong was, unlike the two of us, Armstrong didn't like to talk a lot, and he was very short in his answers. In fact, at one point, Madeleine O'Hare, I mentioned her already, she announced after the moon landing that it was great that an atheist was the first person to get off of to stand on the moon. She thought that was great. And so at the news conference, they asked Armstrong, they said, you know, Madeleine O'Hare says that you're an atheist, and his response was, she didn't ask me. And he wasn't an atheist, he's a deist. His mother was evangelical, but he was a deist, and so he wasn't an atheist. And he said, well, she didn't ask me. So he always answered very, that's the way he was. So it's very taciturn
terse,
person.
yeah, terse man.
Very, they say Collins was the one that was fun to be around. He was disappointed that they weren't a great team. He's the one I think I already talked about, Amiable Strangers. He wished that they had palled around more and they had done more things together. And then Buzz Aldrin, we all know a lot about him relative to his ego. Very trying
I think you're
person,
making too much about his ego.
Am I okay? Maybe not.
I mean, the rap on Aldrin is not his ego. The rap on Aldrin is that he's unstable.
Okay. That's much kinder.
Well, but I mean, let's get it. I mean, we should get it right. I mean, he had an ego, but I'm sure they all did. I mean, Armstrong, if this book is accurate, Armstrong made sure that he was the first man on the moon. He trumped Buzz Aldrin. He knew what that meant. Aldrin is a more difficult person. He was a bit of a bore. People said that at NASA events he wanted to talk rendezvous, and people just got tired of him talking about it. Well, he was the world's expert on this subject, but he was a bore. Sure, he had an ego, and he was edgier. He was not, you know, what makes Armstrong such a perfect exemplar is that he's as close to personality-less as you can get and still have a personality, which is exactly what we wanted. That's precisely what you want. You want someone who will, you know, fulfill the checklist, who won't mouth off, who's not going to freelance up there, who is stable, steady, straight, who's not going to gab. He was a perfect exemplar of what we were trying to do, but dull. That's the problem. And this book talks about what's happened since, that there's been an Armstrong collapse, that he has left. I mean, Craig Nelson makes the case that Armstrong has done us a disservice because he's been back for 40 years and he has never delivered his understanding of the significance of this. He's never graced us with a Columbus-like moment where he tells us what he thinks this is and why he did it and so on. He's just very straight. Aldrin is a very, very complex man, a man who would take the mass on the surface of the moon. Aldrin came back, as you know, and had a nervous breakdown. And he's basically, I don't mean this as a cheap shot, but he's basically still having it 40 years later. I mean, if you're the second man on the moon and you wind up on Dancing with the Stars, you have some identity boundary issues. You have some, you know, this is an odd choice. I don't see William Clark on Dancing with the Stars or Columbus on Dancing with the Stars. He's one of the most important men on earth, and now he's dancing on national television for people vote on a 1-800 number. I mean, this is nuts.
And dancing badly, I'm told.
I mean, this is insane that he would find himself lowered to this opportunity. Who talked him into this? I don't know. Probably his, you know, 18th wife. But he had a nervous breakdown, and then he wrote. But I love Buzz Aldrin. He wrote a fascinating book called Return to Earth. And he wrote that just a couple of years after returning, I think in 1978. And in the book, I have a copy of it, I just was rereading it this morning. In the book he says, when you've been to the moon, what's left? What happens when you peak in your 30s and you're not going back and you're not going to Mars and you've had this peak moment and everything else is Dancing with the Stars. I mean, everything else is lower. And he says, what do you do? And he actually says that afterwards, when he was having this nervous breakdown, he became an alcoholic. He had an affair. His marriage broke up. He became a fundamentalist Christian for a while. He's had a very long, hard identity journey, let's call it an odyssey, which makes him interesting, I think, because he has been to the moon. You want that to get inside. You want that to get in somewhere and not just say, oh, yeah, I did it. I pushed buttons 8, 9, and 10. That's Armstrong. Aldrin's trying to figure it out. And so he brought a complex personality to it. He was complex in it, and he's been really complex since. And in Return to Earth, he said he used to find himself at astronaut events in Houston, picnics and barbecues, and he would literally go out into the backyard and look up at the moon all alone and ask himself, honestly, did I even go? Have I ever been there? I mean, it's been really tough. And what he said, if you heard in that little clip we started with, Neil Armstrong says, isn't it magnificent when they're on the moon? And Aldrin says, magnificent desolation. And he's recently released, I think, his 5th book called Magnificent Desolation, and it's about his life after he returned from the moon. And so I regard him as a key witness in the history of space, just as I regard Meriwether Lewis as a key witness, much more than William Clark, because these people who let it get in are inevitably going to get destabilized by this. If it doesn't get in, then why do it? You're not buying it.
Well, I'm trying to process that.
But don't you, I mean,
but we're
they're
running out of
interesting.
time, but if you let it get in and it leads to depression and alcoholism and Meriwether Lewis's suicide, then what good is it too? I mean, I would rather have somebody that's much more analytical about it and understands that they just have.
So you run into Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong at a McDonald's. Who do you want to have a conversation with? I mean, Neil Armstrong is going to say, oh yeah, it was a 342 valve.
Yeah.
You know, that's it. So you've been to the moon, you're the first man on the moon, you're the Columbus, you're the first human being who's ever gone beyond our gravitational system and stepped foot on another entity in the solar system, and all you want to talk about is switches? I mean, come on, we want a poet. We want someone who's going to, I don't care if he commits suicide or not, I hope he doesn't. But the fact that Meriwether Lewis committed suicide is a horrible thing. But there's a certain, and I mean this very seriously, Larry, there's a certain deep, deep, deep authenticity to the Lewises and the Aldrins of the world because they do let it in. And maybe with better counseling, Lewis would have lived. Buzz Aldrin is apparently a cheerful fellow. I voted for him on Dancing with the Stars. And not a bad dancer for an 80-year-old man. But don't you agree with me that you want some angst in here somewhere?
One of the things that in Rocket Man he says is that we didn't send poets into space. And I think that's true. Engineers and scientists, I mean, that's how it was going to. You and I couldn't command a spacecraft and get there. I mean, we don't have the right stuff.
I'll speak for yourself. I've been with you to Montana.
Yeah. The source of the Missouri.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay.
But wait, answer my question.
Which one?
You're ducking it, and that is, I mean, I know you like Armstrong. Great. We all like and admire Neil Armstrong. But don't you agree that he has given us an insufficient reflection? And Aldrin, for all of the craziness of Aldrin, has given us a much more extraordinary reflection.
Yeah. Well, sure, that would be nice, but I think that the reverse would have happened. I think you could have ended up with Armstrong, if he had a different personality and had come back saying, hey, look at me, I'm the first guy that ever walked on the moon.
Well, his wife did divorce him on that very issue.
What was that? I'm
Remember
not going to carry out the garbage. I've walked on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, his wife Jan finally said enough on this first on the moon thing.
Yeah. So, okay, there's some points we got to get to here. All right.
But you won't answer the question. See, this is typical of you. Here we are. This is funded by the State Humanities Council. We are brought here to wrestle with these questions. We're not here to talk about throw weights and oxygen versus hydrogen. You and I don't even know about this. We just make a lot of this up.
Yeah, we do.
So what we're here to talk about is to wrestle with ideas.
Yeah.
And the idea that I'm trying to put to you is, going back to my list, why did we go? What did we accomplish? We know how we went, more or less. Yeah. What did we accomplish, and what does it mean? And just to skip ahead, von Braun and Cronkite and Severide and others,
let's go through
Margaret
those
Mead,
and we can...
said this is like this key moment in human history. Here's Wernher von Braun. I think it's equal in importance to that moment in evolution when aquatic life came crawling up on the land. There's the father of the Saturn V saying this is one of the greatest moments in the history of the planet. Here's Walter Cronkite. Well, this is when they launched. Everything else that has happened in our time is going to be an asterisk. Eric Severide, we seem some kind of a birth here. And Eric Severide said, and I should have brought it, and he said, these astronauts will always be strangers to us now. They will always, we will never quite understand them. They'll always be detached from us. Well, that's Armstrong. And maybe that's the way he's coping with it. But these guys, Walter Cronkite and Eric Sevareid and Margaret Mead and Kurt Vonnegut and thousands of people wrote their newspaper columns and their opinion pieces about this and wrote books about it. And they tried to make sense of what this means. Norman Mailer wrote the best book. It's called Of a Fire on the Moon, and it's about Apollo 11. It's a magnificent book by America's greatest novelist of the time. They're all wrestling with it. What does it signify? What does this mean? What will this do to mankind? And these people are saying, Larry, it ain't ever going to be the same. But when I look around at the year 2010, it looks the same. I mean, do you see any area outside of Teflon where we have changed in any significant way as a species, as humanity?
No.
So they were saying this photograph alone was going to change the basic conceptual perception of humans about the universe, and it didn't. Not yet, anyway.
No, it hasn't. We certainly left that time behind, and I'm not sure. Well, I guess the bottom line to it is we beat the Soviets, and then the Soviets says, okay, you beat us. And all the wind in the sail of going to the moon and doing all this stuff just dissipated. So it really was a matter of the Cold War. It really was a matter of so the folks that were doing this, the scientists, the technicians, the engineers, and the politicos, accomplished their mission. The problem is that the poets and the scholars weren't there and weren't provided the opportunity then to be part of that, to explain it the way you wanted to explain it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're trivializing my point. You're just sort of saying,
no.
I wish we'd sent an English major to the moon. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't care who we send. I want them to have a genuine, deep, life-altering, consciousness-changing, wrestling with, and not quite making sense of it, alive to the wonder and mystery response. And of these 12, some interesting things have happened. Buzz Aldrin had a nervous breakdown, and he's continuing to wrestle with it, and so I admire that, whether you agree with him or not. But I think Buzz Aldrin's experience, for example, does more to explain what happened to Meriwether Lewis than any other thing. And so he helps us. He helps us understand what happens to the explorer. And I hosted a symposium in Lewis and Clark College a few years ago on this, and we had a philosopher come in. He said, apropos of Lewis, how far can you go out and still come back psychologically? And both Aldrin and Lewis went farther, apparently, than they could come back. But James Irwin, who was the 8th man on the moon, said that he saw God, that he felt the presence of the Lord, the Judeo-Christian Lord, not a deist God, but he felt the presence of God on the moon. And that became a very controversial thing that he said, because NASA was embarrassed. I don't know why. I mean, he's entitled to his view. But several of them, my point is that several of them have had extraordinary post-lunar lives because they let it in some way. But Armstrong is just like an Iceman.
Mm-hmm. But everyone that's letting him in the way you want him to let it in is ending up with all these problems. So there's an advantage to that?
Well, what's the purpose of life? You know, I mean, so what, to be well-adjusted and attend Rotary is better than having a nervous breakdown? You've been to the moon.
I think so.
These aren't guys who went on an exchange with Hettinger. They went to the moon, Larry.
Yeah.
They went to the moon, dude. Look at it. I mean, they went to another place in the solar system. Yeah. You don't want them to readjust. If they readjust too easily, then it was just like, well, you might have gone to London. Yeah. You're not buying it?
No.
Okay. I give up. But you see the point.
I absolutely see the point. I just don't know that there's an advantage to
well, how many books has Armstrong written about his experience? Answer that question.
I can't.
Yeah, Buzz Aldrin has written 5, count them 5. He's trying to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. So that's cool. I mean, I'm not wishing anyone ill, Larry, but there has been a poverty of let's put it this way, leave out the individuals. Yep. Walter Cronkite says it's going to be an asterisk. Werner von Braun says we're crawling out of the primordial swamp here. Mm-hmm. From any rational point of view, that has not proved to be the case. Now, there's a hilarious moment in this book where he has Henry Kissinger with Zhou Enlai in Beijing when Kissinger first went to open up China for Nixon. And they're at a dinner party, they're at a dinner together, and Kissinger says to Zhou Enlai, who's a historian, he says, well, what do you think was the significance of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai says, oh, it's too early to tell.
Yeah.
You know, it's several hundred years ago, but the Chinese take a longer view, is the point. Yeah. The Confucian world is not like what happened yesterday and how short can the soundbite be. So maybe it's too soon. Maybe this is true. Maybe there will be a consciousness change, and it's too early. After all, didn't you say last night Columbus was 1492, but 1607 is right. Jamestown. So maybe we are premature in asking for humanity to absorb this thing. But I think we should demand that, and we should, on these anniversaries, that's why we're doing this. It was the 40th anniversary this year. That's why we're having this conversation, so that it's not so we don't forget conversation, it's so that we do try to process this continuously.
And on that note, we really did roll up almost to 5 o'clock here.
Oh my.
But if there's one quick question somebody has of our expert here that...
No, I think you're being like Armstrong. You're sitting there inscrutably in your glasses.
Anybody want to know anything else about Buzz Aldrin?
There's several questions here, yes.
No. Go ahead.
Well, I didn't want to ask a question about Buzz Aldrin, but I wanted to say, Clay, that there has been a sea change, and that since this happened, and that has to do with the concept of the nature of the universe. At the time this was coming, they were starting this program, it was still in the Western world accepted that the world was created in 4,000 years. Boyle's nature of the universe and Big Bang theory was something that only a few scientists even comprehended, let alone accepted. Certainly nowhere else in this Western world, and where are we today? It's almost defeated.
Well, so that she's suggesting there has been a change, that we've moved from an Earth that's 4,000 or 5,000 years old to one that's at least 4.5 billion years old, and that's changed our basic perceptions. I doubt, I'll just say, I hear you, and of course that's a wonderful thing, but I doubt that this is the result of the moon landing.
No, but it happened during that time.
Happened in the same time period, certainly.
And in fact, the scientists that were part of this.
Yes, there were scientists, of course, hundreds and thousands of them behind the scenes, and a couple of them actually wound up on the moon. And they did confirm, they found a rock on Apollo 14, I think, or 15, Larry. They found the so-called Genesis rock. Well, they immediately called it the Genesis rock, but it was 3.5 billion years old. It was the oldest rock they found on the moon, and it confirmed the ancientness of the universe.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
The thing that stands out for me more than anything else you said was at one point you said, and they were worried, terribly worried that the Russians would get to the moon before us. And when I looked up at that picture, I just thought, how incredibly trivial and petty that motivation seems, that perhaps there's more to our motivations than we may perceive.
Saying that, yeah.
Have joint flights to, the space station. We work with the Russians. We cannot see where we're headed and may not know why. But I think the choice, however wrong-headed it may have been, leads us somewhere.
That's a great statement. Can you paraphrase some of that?
Dan's point is that it sounds really trivial and petty to say that we're on the moon because of the Cold War and we had to beat the Russians, and that's the driving motivation behind it. And I would agree that sounds petty, but that was the motivation.
Well, one
behind
of
the
them.
space.
One of them. It wasn't the only
All
motivation.
right. One of the important ones. And but what an opportunity we have now in working with the Russians and doing things with them, and so we don't know. Maybe it is too soon for us to know what the result is. But it certainly opens up that door of possibilities now and now we're going to have to collaborate with the Russians. And of course, Cold War's over, which, by the way, we won. That's what we like to say. We won. And so, but certainly a valid point.
But, I mean,
actually, it is 5 o'clock.
But I just want to say two quick things about this. One is, I think that he's right, Dan's right. I mean, in the sense that because we did it for some of the wrong reasons, when we had achieved it, the air went out of the project. If we had done it for the right reason, which is sort of the man's nobility and, search the universe, long term, that's what Barack Obama is saying now. I don't like what he said in canceling those projects, but he's saying, we should step back and not do this as a feat. We should build an integrated, long-term, really smart, step-by-step approach to further exploration of the solar system and the universe, and that we should not make the mistake this time of doing what we did last time. That's what he's trying to say in all of this, and I think that makes perfect sense, that we did it for some of the wrong reasons, and because of that, we couldn't sustain the energy once we had achieved the quite specific goal that we had. But I didn't want to close without saying something really positive about Armstrong, and that is, when they got there, as you know, they had a crisis. They had some computer malfunctions. The computers were so tiny that they couldn't process all that was coming in. And two warning lights came on, and those warning lights could have led NASA to abort, and probably should have led NASA to abort. But the key man who was in charge of this said, no, we're a go, and they worked through it. Well, because they had a couple of these problems, they overshot their landing site by 4 miles. And if they'd overshot by 7 miles, they would have had to abort. They came in too fast, too far, and when they got to the new landing site that they were sort of inevitably going to land at, Neil Armstrong looked down and it was filled with jags and boulders, and he thought it was an unsafe place to land. So he took manual control and landed the Eagle, the lunar excursion module of Apollo 11, and NASA wanted him to land much sooner than he did. When he finally did land, and everyone who was there remembers that moment, Houston Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed. When he finally did land, they had 6 seconds of fuel in the rocket. The mission control wanted that thing down with at least a minute of fuel left in the rocket. They were going nuts because he was searching for a level place to land. He finally found one, but he was dangerously testing that fuel gauge. And if anything had gone wrong and they had crashed on the moon, imagine this. But so this is an Iron Man. I mean, he flew that thing, and people were saying, you gotta land, you gotta land, you gotta land. And he was gonna do it his way, and he did it, and he did an absolutely perfect landing. In fact, they didn't even know they had landed at first because it was such a soft landing that they felt no impact. And so this is an extraordinary flyer, whatever else he isn't.
In one of the news conferences, in one of the news conferences before they went, they were trying to get out of the astronauts what personal items they were going to take up with them. And when they asked Neil Armstrong, what would you like to take with you, he said, more fuel.
Well, that's the closest we got. I mean, we were very close to running out of gas.
So it's 5 o'clock. Clay, thank you for a very nice year.
For a year. And how about my iPad?
Thank you, everybody.